Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now in today's one we're going to be taking a look at the i3-13100F, Intel's newest entry level processor, in pairing with an ARC A750, a GPU that has had its problems especially with drivers since it launched, but I feel like it's in a place now where it makes a lot more sense to purchase. Of course it isn't 100% perfect, but I thought we'd see what this sort of mid-range combination could do at 1440p in a handful of modern and a couple of older titles. Quick word on yesterday's video, it was up for about an hour, it was a GTA 5 minimum spec video. I wasn't happy with it, it felt half-hearted, so I'll re-upload it soon, but it'll be a lot better than it was. Anyway, back to today's video, and we of course have the i3-13100F, the ARC A750 with the latest drivers at the time of this video, resizable bar enabled because that is essential for squeezing the best performance out of one of these GPUs. And without further ado, let's get into it and kick off with our first game, Modern Warfare 2. This is running, of course, at 1440p with the balanced preset, and the only thing I changed was the textures, which I set to high. Now on average we saw a very nice 87 frames per second with a 1% low of 64 and a 0.1% low of 48. I've targeted at least 60 FPS today in all of our tested games because I feel that that is a nice place to be in 2023, especially with a setup like this. Now 1080p is going to give you a much better chance of achieving that with even higher settings, but I feel like this setup is much better suited to 1440p, and it's a setup that can handle such a resolution without breaking the bank, so to speak. Next up is GTA Definitive Edition, San Andreas that is. This has had some problems of its own as well since launch. Again, I feel this is in a better place these days, but the game does benefit from DX12 mode. You can launch this with a command from within the Rockstar launcher. This gives us much better performance, especially with the ARC A750, which is best suited to DX12, although some major driver improvements have been made to improve the card with DX9, DX10 and DX11 games as well. The 1% low was pretty respectable here in GTA SA, but the 0.1% low still does leave a little bit to be desired, but this is more of a game problem than it is a card problem, I'm going to have to say. In Red Dead Redemption 2 here, of course at 1440p again, I've gone with Digital Foundry's console equivalent settings, which I feel always give us a nice combination of visual fidelity and performance. The average frame rate was very good, 95 on average, with a 0.1% low of 46 and a 1% low of 68, so even in those busier town areas, the game was holding very steady indeed with this combination. Now I think the RX 6600 is a card that's easier to recommend if you want stability, and so is the RTX 3060. Both of those make much more sense if you want something that you know is going to work flawlessly out of the box. The A750, I feel, as well as the A770, is still very much a sort of, I don't know, an early adopter type card, but as I said at the beginning, there have been some massive improvements to drivers, and I feel like it's a lot more sensible to buy one now than it was a few months ago. Drivers are only improving this thing every single time they get updated, to be honest. In Elden Ring here with the high preset, I left the 60 FPS cap in place just because this is how most of you will probably experience it straight out of the box, so to speak, but 60 FPS on average, it had no problem hitting that at this resolution, and the percentile lows were also very respectable, 55 and 43. Now I played for about 20-30 minutes and this held steady at 60 frames per second, so yeah, this is going to give us no problems, and it looks absolutely fantastic with this preset. You could potentially push things to the maximum preset with the FPS cap in place and still hit 60, but I think there are going to be a few more dips and drops here and there. In Grand Theft Auto 5, here are the settings. I've used the highest graphics settings, but everything under the advanced options menu was off. FXAA was also enabled, but I didn't use MSAA here, as that absolutely tanks the performance on the ARC cards, or so I found in my experience. Nonetheless, 116 FPS on average with a 1% low of 81 and a 0.1% low of 43 here driving about downtown Los Santos. This will improve in countryside areas, but it will also decrease in even busier areas too, though I wouldn't expect to see less than 100 frames per second as an average, and we probably could have pushed up a couple of those advanced graphics options too, all while leaving MSAA disabled. The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt got a next-gen update, as you know, not long ago. This at 1440p, along with my custom settings here, are what I felt was best for this one. There are still going to be a few dips and drops, as you'll see from the gameplay in a moment, but I feel this mix of sort of high and ultra settings is suitable for the i3 13100F and the ARC A750. The average was 96, and where you're going to see most problems is running about busy town areas, but overall it's not going to be a constant stutterfest. There's going to be the occasional dip and drop here and there as you sort of walk into a new area, but apart from that, it's a really nice experience with this setup. I'm also using 16 gigs of RAM, by the way, 3200 MHz DDR4 in dual channel, so nothing special, cheap enough these days as well, though I could recommend 32 gigs, I reckon, and maybe faster memory too. Marvel Spider-Man Remastered here, 1440p of course, with the high preset and nothing else changed. I also enabled TAA, which I think actually enabled itself by default with this preset. We do have FSR options to choose from, but they aren't necessary. Jumping into the gameplay, and the frame rate was 98 FPS on average. Again, a lot of these games I've showed you do probably have a little bit of room for improvement in terms of the graphical settings as well, but I like to leave a little bit of headroom just for the sake of those 1% figures. As you can see here, it was 65, so you can expect drops to the mid 60s, low 70s. Not maxing out these games, I feel, makes a lot more sense, because a lot of the time you're not going to see much of a visual difference anyway, but you might see a pretty hefty dip in performance. That doesn't go for every game, but that's generally what I find in a lot of titles. Now, Apex Legends is a perfect example of a game that has only got better on the ARC graphics cards with driver updates. Here, as you can see, I'm using the highest settings bar the resolution of the textures, which I've set to very high, and I've also turned down the spot shadows to low as well, as this is quite a demanding setting in its own right. Now, in the gameplay here, 114 was the average, enough to remain competitive, I feel, but you could turn a few things down if you want 120, 144, so on. You might be best with 1080p, as this is a competitive online game, but the beauty of PC gaming is that it's always up to you. Now, when I first tried this on an ARC card, the first time I got my hands on one, it was an absolute mess. So the drivers have really improved the performance here, and this goes back to what I was saying about these cards being a lot more easy to recommend in early 2023, and I think it's only going to get better, to be honest. Forza Horizon 5 at 1440p, I don't really need to say the resolution anymore, but the Ultra preset, 92 FPS on average with decent percentile lows as well. In terms of the gameplay, not really much to talk about, no stutter, no frame dips. This always stays pretty consistent on a lot of my hardware in terms of those percentile lows. Rarely do we see major issues with those figures, especially with newer and more capable hardware. I think it's fantastically optimized, to be honest. The studio have done a great job of getting this to run on a wide range of PC components, and the i3 13100F as well as the ARC A750, well, are no exceptions. If you want to save a bit of money, you could always go with the 12100F. There's going to be a little bit of a performance decrease in comparison to the 13100F, but where the GPU is the bottleneck in a lot of scenarios, you're probably not going to see that much of a difference at all, and sometimes you could save 20 or 30 pounds or dollars or euros or whatever by going with the 12100F instead. CSGO was a game that was absolutely disastrous when it first came out. When the ARC first came out, the drivers absolutely hated this game. It ran with a terrible frame rate, and it was just so stuttery. But here, as you can see, there have been some major improvements. We've touched on this in my previous driver video, but now the average was 370 FPS with pretty decent percentile lows. I kept things at lowest for the sake of remaining competitive. I never really see the point in turning things up because it's CSGO, it doesn't look that much better at high, but again, it's up to you. Here though, it ran really, really well, with a solid set of figures. Just like before with Apex, you might want to consider turning things down to 1080p if you want to get the best performance out of the game. Speaking of 1080p, and now we have Cyberpunk 2077, and unfortunately there's no two ways about it, 1080p is the best resolution. 1440p tanks performance, at least natively with the medium settings, but you can enable FSR and set it to performance if you want a similar to 1080p experience. I found that just turning it down to 1080p with the medium preset, the high textures and the medium crowds was the best option for at least 60 FPS, though there will be some dips below this. This has still been slightly improved with driver updates over time, but I think it's the hardware itself here that doesn't particularly agree with Cyberpunk, or this could just be a normal result. I don't really have anything to compare it to at the moment, but 60 FPS is still doable, but 1080p is definitely the best way to go with this game. This is probably the most demanding one on our list today. Apart from Fortnite, surprisingly, which is coming up now. I think all of these competitive online games could perhaps benefit from 1080p instead if you want to max out your frame rate, but I used 1440p today because I wanted to show you that it is doable with this combination. The medium preset in Fortnite then, with 100% scaling, I did alter the view distance to epic instead of the default medium just to see any enemies in the distance. 66 FPS was the average, with a few dips in performance according to the 1.1% lows, but overall it was a playable experience and I was able to remain competitive. The game still looks pretty decent with these settings, but as I said before, you might want to turn things down a little bit if you want the most frames from this game. Overall, the i3-13100F and the ARC A750 make a pretty nice combination. You might want to consider an RX 6600 or 3060 instead. As the price drops of the ARC cards and the drivers get better, I think they do make more sense they make more sense for your consideration in early 2023, and I think they're only going to get easier to recommend as time goes on, but I thought I'd showcase what it can do in pairing with a so-called entry-level CPU in early 2023. Doesn't feel right calling the i3 entry-level really when it's so capable in its own right, despite having just 4 cores and 8 threads. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you did, leave a like, leave a dislike if you didn't. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and hopefully I'll see all of you in the next one.